For centuries, spiritual seekers have searched outside themselves for divine connection, believing Christ was a distant savior to worship. But Joel Goldsmith revealed a mystical truth that transforms everything. Christ is not someone who lived 2,000 years ago. Christ is the divine presence living as your very consciousness right now. This revelation changes the entire foundation of prayer, healing, and spiritual life. When you grasp that Christ constitutes your true identity, you stop begging an external God for help. Instead, you recognize the infinite power already dwelling within you as you. The Christ that you are is not earned through good behavior or years of spiritual practice. It exists as your eternal nature, waiting only for recognition. This single understanding dissolves the illusion of separation between human and divine, revealing your original spiritual wholeness. Most people spend lifetimes seeking what they already possess. Understanding the Christ that you are ends the search and begins the demonstration of divine harmony in every area of your existence. Joel Goldsmith taught that Christ represents your individual spiritual identity, the divine consciousness expressing as your being. This is not blasphemy or ego inflation. It is recognition of the fundamental truth that God constitutes individual being, and that being is you. When you pray believing you are separate from God, you affirm the very lack you seek to overcome. But when you recognize Christ as your consciousness, prayer transforms from begging to recognition. You no longer ask God to heal you because you understand health as your natural spiritual state. This Christ consciousness existed before your physical birth and continues after physical death. It represents the eternal, unchanging reality of who you are beneath all human conditions and circumstances. Your personality, history, and problems are temporary appearances, but Christ is permanent identity. The revelation that you are Christ individualized does not make you superior to others. It reveals the same truth about every person, creating spiritual equality and dissolving judgment. When you see Christ as yourself, you simultaneously recognize Christ as everyone. Traditional religion teaches you to worship Christ. Mystical Christianity teaches you to be Christ. This distinction revolutionizes your entire spiritual approach. Worship creates distance and separation. Recognition of identity creates union and power. Joel understood that Jesus demonstrated Christ consciousness, showing what becomes possible when a human being fully realizes their divine nature. Jesus did not possess something you lack. He revealed what you already are but have not yet recognized. The moment you grasp this truth, healing power activates naturally. You stop trying to get God to change human conditions. Instead, you rest in awareness of your spiritual wholeness, and physical harmony follows as effect. This is recognition prayer, the most powerful form of spiritual practice. Your consciousness, rightly understood, is God individualized as you. This means infinite intelligence, perfect love, and unlimited creative power already exist as your true self. The Christ that you are possesses everything necessary for complete fulfillment in every dimension of life. Here is what happens when you truly understand the Christ that you are. Fear dissolves because you recognize your eternal, indestructible nature. Lack disappears because you know abundance as your spiritual inheritance. Disease loses power because you identify with perfect divine life. But this understanding develops gradually through contemplative practice, not instant intellectual acceptance. You must sit in silence, letting divine truth reveal itself deeper than thoughts. You declare inwardly, I am not this body or personality. I am the Christ, the presence of God made visible. As you practice this recognition daily, sometimes for weeks or months, your consciousness shifts. What once seemed like affirmation becomes living realization. You feel the presence within you, closer than your own heartbeat, more real than physical sensation. This is not denial of human experience, but elevation above it through spiritual identity. Problems do not disappear through wishful thinking. They dissolve in the light of Christ consciousness, recognized as the illusions they always were, powerless against your eternal divine nature. Amanda had struggled with chronic anxiety for 12 years, trying every therapy and medication available. Nothing provided lasting relief. Then she encountered Joel Goldsmith's teaching about the Christ that you are. At first it seemed too simple, almost too good to be true. She began practicing recognition prayer each morning, sitting quietly and acknowledging her true spiritual identity. not the anxious personality she had believed herself to be, but Christ consciousness expressing as her individual being. The practice felt awkward at first, mechanical rather than real. But Amanda persisted for 8 weeks, dedicating 30 minutes daily to this contemplative recognition. Gradually, she noticed something shifting. The anxious thoughts still appeared, but they no longer defined her. She observed them from a deeper place of peace, a spiritual center untouched by human fears. Within 4 months, the chronic anxiety that had controlled her life for over a decade had diminished to occasional mild episodes. Amanda had not fought the anxiety or tried to eliminate it. She had simply recognized her true nature as Christ, and the false identity of anxious person dissolved naturally. Robert owned a struggling business on the verge of bankruptcy. Every conventional solution had failed. In desperation, he studied Joel Goldsmith's mystical teachings and learned about recognizing the Christ that you are as the source of all supply and creativity. Robert began each business day with 15 minutes of contemplative silence, recognizing divine intelligence as his consciousness, infinite abundance as his spiritual nature. He stopped mentally fighting lack and instead rested in awareness of his Christ identity as the presence of all good. The first 3 weeks brought no visible change in business circumstances. Robert felt tempted to abandon the practice as ineffective, but something within urged him to continue, trusting the spiritual principle even without immediate evidence in the physical realm. After 2 months of consistent practice, ideas began flowing into Robert's awareness, creative solutions he had never considered. Within 6 months, his business had completely turned around, not through struggle but through consciousness operating from its true Christ nature. The supply had always existed in consciousness, waiting for recognition. Jessica had experienced painful relationships throughout her adult life, repeatedly attracting partners who betrayed or abandoned her. Traditional therapy helped her understand patterns but could not break them. Then she discovered the mystical principle of recognizing Christ as her identity. She practiced seeing herself not as damaged or unlucky in love, but as the perfect expression of divine love itself. This was not positive thinking or affirmation. It was recognition of spiritual truth beneath all human history and conditioning. For 3 months, Jessica dedicated herself to this contemplative practice daily. She stopped seeking fulfillment in relationships and instead recognized completeness as her Christ nature. The loneliness and desperation that had driven her romantic choices began dissolving in this deeper awareness. Gradually, Jessica's entire approach to relationships transformed. She no longer sought someone to complete her because she recognized her spiritual wholeness. 6 months later, she attracted a healthy partnership based on mutual recognition rather than mutual need. The Christ that she was had dissolved the pattern at its root in consciousness. Daniel struggled with chronic stress that manifested as various physical symptoms affecting his quality of life. His doctors provided excellent medical care, but Daniel wanted to address the underlying consciousness, creating these stress-related challenges alongside his conventional treatment. He began recognizing his true identity, not as stressed personality, but as Christ consciousness, eternally peaceful and complete. This complemented his medical care rather than replacing it. He practiced this contemplative recognition for 45 minutes daily while continuing his doctor's recommendations. Daniel practiced this spiritual approach for 7 months, sometimes experiencing deep peace, other times feeling nothing at all. He continued regardless of feelings, trusting the spiritual principle. Progress was gradual as his consciousness shifted from anxiety-based to peace-centered awareness. Slowly, the stress-related symptoms began diminishing. His doctors noted positive changes in his overall well-being markers. Within 14 months, Daniel's quality of life had dramatically improved through the combination of medical care and spiritual practice. He had recognized the Christ that he was, and inner peace naturally supported physical wellness. Beyond recognizing the Christ that you are, Joel Goldsmith taught impersonalization as a complementary practice. Impersonalization means refusing to assign power to people, conditions, or circumstances. When you know yourself as Christ, you simultaneously recognize that nothing in the human realm possesses real power. Disease appears as a condition with power to harm you. Financial lack seems like a real force limiting your life. Difficult people feel like threats to your well-being. But impersonalization reveals these as powerless appearances, temporary illusions with no substance in spiritual reality. Practice this technique when problems arise. Observe the situation without giving it power or reality. Recognize inwardly that only God, only Christ consciousness, possesses actual power. The appearance, however convincing, is simply that, appearance without spiritual substance or authority. As you combine Christ recognition with impersonalization, you create a double protection. You know your true spiritual nature, and you simultaneously refuse to empower anything contrary to that nature. This dual practice accelerates the dissolution of discord. Another powerful complement is the practice Joel called nothingization. When you recognize the Christ that you are, you understand that anything unlike God is actually nothing attempting to appear as something. Disease is nothing. Lack is nothing. Fear is nothing trying to masquerade as power. Nothingization does not mean ignoring problems. It means seeing through their illusory nature. When a health challenge appears, you do not fight it or fear it. You recognize it as nothing, as the absence of God, rather than a presence with power. Sit quietly and practice this recognition. That financial problem appearing so real, nothing trying to seem like something. That relationship conflict causing stress, nothing attempting to disturb the peace of Christ consciousness that you are. As you consistently nothingize appearances contrary to spiritual truth, they lose their grip on your experience. Not through struggle, but through recognition of their fundamental unreality. The Christ that you are cannot be threatened by nothing pretending to be something. Joel Goldsmith also taught practicing the presence as essential for living from Christ consciousness. Throughout your day, pause frequently to remember your true identity. Not just during meditation, but during ordinary activities, recognize the divine presence operating as your awareness. While working, eating, or conversing, silently acknowledge the Christ that you are. This keeps you anchored in spiritual identity rather than drifting into human personality with all its vulnerabilities and limitations. Set reminders on your phone or create visual cues in your environment. Each reminder prompts you to return to awareness of your Christ nature. This consistent practice gradually shifts your default consciousness from human to divine. At first, you will forget constantly, spending hours in human consciousness before remembering your spiritual identity. But with persistent practice over weeks and months, Christ consciousness becomes more natural, more constant. You increasingly live from your divine center rather than your human periphery. The final complementary technique is conscious awareness of oneness. When you know yourself as Christ, you simultaneously recognize all people as expressions of the same divine consciousness. This dissolves judgment, comparison, and separation that create so much human suffering. Someone treats you badly? Recognize the Christ that they are beneath the human behavior. Someone appears sick or struggling. See through the appearance to their eternal spiritual perfection. This does not mean approving harmful behavior or ignoring genuine needs. It means maintaining your spiritual vision regardless of human appearances. You help practically where appropriate, but you never accept the illusion as ultimate reality. You see Christ everywhere, even where human sense sees only problems and imperfection. This practice transforms relationships, dissolves conflicts, and creates harmony without human effort. When you consistently see Christ in yourself and others, divine love operates naturally through you, healing situations that human methods cannot touch. Oneness awareness completes the recognition of the Christ that you are. Understanding the Christ that you are sounds beautiful in theory, but what about when nothing seems to happen? You practice faithfully for weeks, recognizing your divine identity, yet circumstances remain unchanged. This is the most common challenge spiritual seekers face. Joel Goldsmith taught that spiritual realization operates differently than human effort. You cannot force demonstration through mental willpower. You can only create the inner conditions for truth to reveal itself. Sometimes consciousness requires extended preparation before outer manifestation appears. The temptation during this waiting period is abandoning the practice, concluding it does not work. But this is precisely when persistence matters most. Spiritual principles are not techniques producing guaranteed results on demand. They are truths requiring cultivation in consciousness. Continue your contemplative practice regardless of visible evidence. Some seeds germinate quickly, while others require months underground before sprouting. Your consciousness may need extended preparation before Christ recognition manifests as transformed conditions. Trust the process without demanding immediate proof. Another challenge arises when you experience temporary glimpses of Christ consciousness, followed by long periods of ordinary human awareness. You touch divine peace during meditation, then spend the rest of your day in anxiety, frustration, or fear. This oscillation is completely normal in spiritual development. Joel understood that consciousness does not transform instantly. You are reconditioning awareness that has operated from human identity for decades. Shifting to Christ identity requires patient, consistent practice over extended time. Do not judge yourself for forgetting your divine nature throughout the day. Simply return to recognition whenever you remember. Each return strengthens the new pattern of awareness. Gradually, the periods of Christ consciousness lengthen, while periods of human consciousness shorten. Think of it like learning a musical instrument. At first, you play correctly for seconds before mistakes interrupt. With practice, you sustain correct playing for minutes, then hours. Eventually, correct playing becomes natural and automatic. Christ consciousness develops the same way through consistent recognition. A particularly difficult challenge occurs when serious problems persist despite faithful practice. You have recognized the Christ that you are for months, yet the health condition worsens or the financial crisis deepens. Does this mean the teaching is false? Joel Goldsmith would say no. Sometimes consciousness must thoroughly release false beliefs before demonstration changes. Deep-rooted conditions may require extended inner work before outer healing manifests. Other times, spiritual growth requires experiencing certain challenges for reasons beyond our immediate understanding. The key is maintaining your spiritual practice regardless of appearances. Do not judge the truth by human circumstances. Continue recognizing your Christ nature even when physical evidence suggests otherwise. This is faith in the deepest sense, trusting spiritual reality more than material appearance. Seek appropriate medical care when needed. Use practical wisdom in financial matters. Joel never taught abandoning human common sense. But do these things while maintaining consciousness of your spiritual identity, knowing that ultimate healing and supply flow from recognition of the Christ that you are. The final major challenge is dealing with people who judge or criticize your spiritual practice. Family members may call it delusional. Friends might worry about your mental health. Religious authorities could condemn it as heresy or ego inflation. Joel faced similar criticism throughout his teaching career. He understood that mystical Christianity threatens conventional religious structures. Recognizing the Christ that you are challenges centuries of doctrine teaching human unworthiness and separation from God. Do not argue or try to convince skeptics. Your demonstration will prove the teaching more effectively than words. Simply continue your practice quietly, allowing transformed consciousness to speak through improved circumstances and inner peace. Find community with others on the mystical path if possible. Joel's students supported each other through these challenges. But whether alone or with spiritual friends, remain committed to truth regardless of external opposition or misunderstanding. If these obstacle-dissolving insights speak to your spiritual journey, like this video to support transformative content, subscribe for advanced mystical teachings, and comment, which challenge are you currently facing in recognizing the Christ that you are? William was a corporate executive facing intense workplace pressure that triggered panic attacks. After 6 months of recognizing the Christ that he was, he discovered how to maintain spiritual identity even during high-stress meetings and impossible deadlines. He practiced returning to Christ consciousness throughout his workday, taking brief moments between meetings to recognize his divine nature. This was not escaping responsibility, but fulfilling it from a higher level of consciousness, bringing divine intelligence to human challenges. Gradually, William noticed that problems, which once overwhelmed him, now appeared manageable. Not because circumstances changed, but because his consciousness had shifted. He operated from spiritual center rather than human personality, accessing wisdom and peace unavailable to merely human thinking. After 18 months of this integrated practice, William's entire career had transformed. He received promotions based on the creative solutions flowing through his Christ consciousness. He led teams with spiritual authority rather than human force. His recognition of divine identity had revolutionized not just inner life but outer professional success. Nancy struggled with deep-seated shame from childhood trauma that traditional therapy had addressed but not resolved. When she began recognizing the Christ that she was, she discovered a spiritual identity untouched by human history or psychological wounds. The practice was difficult at first because shame insisted she was fundamentally damaged, unworthy of divine identity. But Nancy persisted, recognizing Christ as her truth regardless of what human experience seemed to prove. She practiced this recognition for 9 months before breakthrough occurred. One morning during meditation, Nancy felt a profound shift. The shame that had defined her for 40 years suddenly appeared as something separate from her true self. She was not the traumatized person. She was Christ consciousness having a human experience that included trauma. This realization did not erase the memories or instantly heal all emotional wounds, but it provided a spiritual foundation beneath the human healing work. Over the following year, Nancy's therapy became more effective because she approached it from Christ identity rather than damaged personality. The deepest healing flowed from recognizing who she truly was. Brian and Michelle were a married couple on the verge of divorce after 20 years together. Neither traditional counseling nor separation had resolved their conflicts. Finally, they explored Joel Goldsmith's teaching, each learning to recognize the Christ that they were. The practice transformed their relationship in unexpected ways. Instead of seeing each other as sources of frustration or disappointment, they began recognizing the divine presence expressing as their partner. This did not magically eliminate all conflicts or personality differences, but it created a spiritual foundation beneath human interactions. When arguments arose, they could return to seeing Christ in themselves and each other. This perspective dissolved resentment and opened space for genuine communication, rather than defensive reaction. After 14 months of consistent practice, individually and sometimes together, their marriage had completely renewed. Not through changing each other, but through each recognizing their own Christ nature. The love that flowed from spiritual identity proved far more powerful than human romantic love, creating partnership based on mutual recognition of divine truth. Catherine faced an adult child struggling with addiction, a situation that had drained her emotionally and financially for years. Every attempt to help had failed, leaving Catherine feeling powerless and despairing. Then she learned about recognizing the Christ that you are. Catherine began practicing recognition not just for herself, but for her child. She refused to see her son as an addict, instead recognizing the Christ that he was beneath all human behavior and appearance. This was not denial of the addiction problem or refusal to maintain appropriate boundaries. It was spiritual vision that saw truth beneath appearance. Catherine continued supporting recovery practically where appropriate, but she stopped mentally defining her son by his struggle. She held consciousness of his spiritual perfection, even when human circumstances showed only continued addiction. The transformation occurred gradually over 16 months. Her son entered recovery and sustained sobriety for the first time in a decade. Catherine understood that her recognition of his Christ identity had created spiritual space for his own awakening. The most powerful help she could offer was seeing him truly, beneath all human conditions. After months or years of practicing recognition of the Christ that you are, something remarkable happens. The practice that once required effort becomes natural awareness. You no longer have to remind yourself of your spiritual identity because you live from it consistently. This does not mean you never experience human challenges or emotions. It means you experience them from a foundation of spiritual truth rather than human vulnerability. Problems arise, but they no longer define you or threaten your fundamental peace. You discover what Joel Goldsmith meant by living in two worlds simultaneously, active and effective in human affairs while remaining anchored in Christ consciousness. This integration represents spiritual maturity, the fruit of consistent contemplative practice over extended time. The recognition that once seemed like hopeful belief has become living realization. You know yourself as Christ, not because you have convinced yourself intellectually, but because divine presence has revealed itself as your deepest nature. This inner knowing transforms everything without changing anything externally. Your relationships operate from a completely different foundation. Instead of seeking fulfillment or validation from others, you interact from spiritual completeness. You love without need, give without expectation, and receive without dependency. Work becomes expression of divine intelligence rather than struggle for survival or success. Creative ideas flow naturally because you recognize infinite wisdom as your consciousness. Problems resolve more easily because you approach them from spiritual insight rather than limited human thinking. Health stabilizes at a higher level as your body responds to consciousness rooted in perfect spiritual life. Not that you never experience physical challenges, but they no longer dominate your awareness or control your peace. You maintain spiritual identity regardless of bodily conditions. Even financial supply operates differently. You recognize abundance as your spiritual nature rather than something external to acquire. This consciousness attracts resources, opportunities, and provisions that human planning could never arrange. Joel taught that consciousness of Christ identity is consciousness of all supply. Perhaps most importantly, you develop unshakable inner peace that persists regardless of external circumstances. This is not the temporary peace of favorable conditions, but the permanent peace of knowing your eternal spiritual nature. Fear loses its power because you recognize your indestructible Christ identity. Death itself appears differently, not as ending but as transition within eternal consciousness. Nothing in the human realm can truly threaten what you know yourself to be. This peace radiates naturally to others without conscious effort. People sense something different about you, a spiritual presence that calms and uplifts without words. You become a healing presence simply by being conscious of the Christ that you are. Your entire life purpose clarifies. You understand that you are here to demonstrate divine consciousness in human form, to reveal spiritual truth through transformed living. Not to convince or convert others, but to let your light shine, allowing Christ in you to bless everyone you encounter. Understanding the Christ that you are is not the end of spiritual seeking, but the beginning of spiritual living. Joel Goldsmith revealed this mystical truth to awaken you from the dream of human limitation into the reality of divine identity. The practice is simple, but requires dedication. Sit daily in contemplative silence, recognizing your true nature. Throughout your day, return repeatedly to awareness of Christ as your consciousness. Refuse to assign power to anything unlike God. Persist patiently through challenges and delays. Remember that this is not instant transformation but gradual awakening. Some practitioners experience dramatic shifts quickly while others require years of faithful practice. Trust your unique spiritual timing. The recognition that you are Christ consciousness will deepen naturally as you cultivate awareness. Your life purpose is to know yourself truly and to demonstrate that knowing through transformed conditions. When you understand the Christ that you are, you stop living as limited human personality and begin living as infinite divine presence individualized. This single realization contains all the power you will ever need for complete spiritual fulfillment. If your understanding of spiritual identity has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith revelations, like this video to help others discover their Christ nature, subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings, and comment, "I am the Christ," to affirm your divine identity and spiritual awakening.